Good morning, all. How are we doing? Feeling good? Yeah? Spring is almost here. I just found, well, I was reminded. No, I found out. One of the two. I guess I really knew it was coming, but I didn't know it was coming, but it's coming. Like next week is daylight savings time. Did you know that? Wow. I think it's next Sunday we have to be careful because that's when we're losing an hour, right? Something like that. So it's not going to be a... I don't remember, but I just know there'll be more light later on in the day, and that's the good stuff, right? That's the good part. So I'm really excited about that. I get more done in the afternoon, so I really appreciate that bit. Now, I don't mean to be critical if I ever step on toes, but I have to admit I'm really not into the whole Twitter phenomenon, and so if you love tweeting, this really isn't meant to be directed to you. But a couple of things hold me back when I'm thinking about this whole tweeting thing. First of all, the whole idea of the possibility of making a fool of myself. So that's never a good thing. So I wanted to share with you some classic tweets that just illustrate the danger that lies out there. So number one, here's a question that was tweeted out: does it take 18 months for twins to be born or 9? Okay, you just don't want that out there attached to your name, right? Or number two, I want my first daughter to be a girl. That was, okay, I'm just think that one through a little bit. Now, you might not get this reference depending on how old you are and how well you are into Hollywood and all that kind of stuff, but Will Smith kind of looks like that guy on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And if you're not familiar with Will Smith or the show, he was the actor on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That's why he looks like that guy. Number four, how did Beyonce's album go number one in 100 countries when there are only 7? Asia, Africa, Antarctica, Australia, North and South America, and Europe. So it's like, okay, let's go back to school on that one. Recall. Is there a reclaim button on your tweets? I don't know. Once it's out there, I think it's out there, right? I don't know. Number 5, I'm going to go stop smoking for a week. I feel bad for my liver. So, no problem with anatomy. And then number 6, how can they steal my identity if they don't look like me? That won't work. So it's just one of those things where, you put that thing out there and it's out there forever, and people will look back on that and think, wow, where did you go to school? Then there's the whole problem of just the inane tweets. I just really don't think my life is that interesting that I want to share it with the whole world. So who really needs to know that I'm shopping at Kroger at this moment, unless it's my wife and she wants me to pick something up? But nobody else needs to know that, or that I'm at the gym or whatever it might be. But there is this kind of aspect to tweeting, which is part of this far larger phenomenon that plays to our own vanity. In fact, experts have highlighted the fact that people use social media to construct kind of an image for themselves. And they pick and choose only the best parts of their life, and they craft it in such a way that it gives a certain impression of who you are and what you're about, which isn't really reflecting the true nature of your life. But in fact, you almost, do things so that you can post it and people will think a certain way about you. And I think, in some ways, this is simply just a symptom of a larger aspect of our culture, of a self-absorbed society, where we are really into ourselves, where I can become the star of my own show. And so it's kind of like, if you remember that movie, The Truman Show, where everybody was following this one guy, and he was a big TV program, that we kind of created that for ourselves, that everybody's, at least we imagine, everybody's kind of really interested in what we're doing, even the mundane things of life. And so this whole idea, the myth that we're talking about this morning, is it's all about me. But that myth runs up really strongly against the fundamental call of Jesus. And one of the key passages I want to start with this morning is from Mark 8:34, if you remember this particular text. Then he called a crowd to him along with his disciples, and he said, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." And so here what we have in this verse is, at the very heart of the definition of discipleship is this call to deny oneself. And I wonder if we can even hear this text anymore, especially in America, where we've learned how to streamline Christianity and to remove many of its difficult obstacles. I mean, in the old days, Christianity was kind of an all-or-nothing proposition, and some people even died for their faith. But being a Christian in America is kind of the most painless thing that it could be. Indeed, in many churches, what you have is a goal to become this kind of full-service institution that treats Christianity as if it's some kind of product, and that Christians are consumers. And so you have the me church, where in reality we create this full laundry list of services to attract people. And so we've got, the coffee bar, we've got children's services, and we've got special interest class, and we've got a gymnasium, we've got the whole 9 yards. And I don't want to be overly critical of that, but when we put all that in there so that we can, quote unquote, win people to Jesus, you're thinking, well, what are you winning them to? And so we become experts at reducing the call of Christ to its bare minimum. And American Christianity has become, in many places, a consumerist religion, where it's all about me. And so how can we hear this text? How should we hear this text? What does it mean to deny oneself? What exactly is Jesus calling his followers to do in this passage? Does Jesus want us to repudiate who we are and think nothing of ourselves? Is this a denial of self because self is somehow bad or evil or wrong and that we have to get rid of that? What does cross-bearing look like, today? How would we recognize it if we were to see it? So, more importantly, perhaps, as we think about this text, why does this text not haunt us? If denying self and carrying the cross defines disciples of Christ, how can we dismiss it so easily as if it really doesn't matter? It's kind of one of those extraneous aspects of the faith. And one problem that I've always had, trying to get a handle on this kind of stuff is when especially as a younger Christian, I was trying to find some concrete way to figure out what it means to follow Jesus. And the only model I had was of those disciples who were traipsing around the countryside, literally following Jesus, as he went around teaching and preaching. It's like, well, I can't really do that. And how does that have any connection with living in a country where there's such great prosperity and security and ease? In fact, as I look back at the history of Christianity, we've got all kinds of models for how people interpreted this text, and I don't find any of them fairly helpful. So I want to give you a list of some of these different ways in which people have thought through this text. And the first one is a guy named Ignatius. You see, when we enter into the 2nd century, of course, you have a lot of persecution going on by the Roman authorities, and Ignatius was a 3rd century bishop of Antioch. And he was arrested around 110 when he ran afoul of the Emperor Trajan. And we're not exactly sure what happened or why he got arrested. But for our purposes, what's interesting is how he responded to his fate. Because as he was on his way to die in Rome, in the arena, he wrote a series of letters. And in several of those, it was just kind of, finishing up business and telling the churches what he wanted them to do. But in a couple of them, he begins to talk specifically about what is going to happen to him when he gets to Rome, and specifically that he wants to die for his faith. And so let's listen to his own words here. He says, this is to the church at Rome, by the way. I'm writing to all the churches and state emphatically to all that I die willingly for God, if you don't hinder me. I beg you, do not show me an unseasonable kindness. Permit me to be food for the wild beasts, which are the means of making my way to God. God's wheat I am, and by the teeth of the wild beasts I am to be ground, that I may prove Christ's pure bread. Better still, coax the wild beasts to become my tomb, and to leave no part of my person behind. Once I have fallen asleep, I do not wish to be a burden to anyone. Then only shall I be a genuine disciple of Jesus Christ, when the world will not even see my body. So for Ignatius, following Jesus involved giving up one's own life for faith. That by imitating Jesus in his death, you became a true disciple. And so as we think about that, it's kind of like, all right, is this what Jesus meant by denying oneself? Does one have to die for the faith to be a true disciple of Jesus? That would be, I think, fairly unfortunate for us for a number of reasons, one of which is that the likelihood of us dying for our faith in America is probably not very high. And so maybe none of us will be ever true disciples of Jesus. Or consider another guy, the life of Anthony. Anthony is one of the earliest desert hermits who models a particular kind of ascetic life. Anthony was born about the middle of the 3rd century to wealthy parents. They died when he was about 20. And he would go to church, of course, regularly, kind of trying to figure out what it meant to be a disciple of Jesus. And one day, while he was in church, they were reading a specific passage which said, "If you will be perfect, go and sell all you have." That was in the story of the rich young ruler, by the way. And he felt at that moment that God was directing that very specifically at him. And so he sold all of his possessions and devoted himself exclusively to religious practices. Now, it wasn't unusual for people in those days to do various kinds of religious practices like prayer and fasting and devoting themselves to God in very ascetic ways. But most people would do that among their family and friends, in town, if you will. But Anthony decided that he was going to move out into the desert. And so he's living in this little village outside, or I should say he's living outside of a village, trying to be a hermit, trying to devote himself to these spiritual practices. But he kept getting, interrupted by people. They were too close. So he decided that he would go even farther out. He crossed the Nile, and he found an old fort, and he walled himself up into this old fort, and he lived there for 20 years without seeing a single person by face. People would come, and they would throw food over the wall, but he wouldn't see them. So they provided for him. And so he was living in this way, in an ascetic way. And I would say, well, yeah, this is most definitely a form of self-denial. That has to be granted. But is that really what Christ is calling us to a solitary life of ascetic denial? Because I can't help but think that in at least some ways, this is simply another form of self-absorption, where he is focusing on his own spiritual journey and really not concerned about anyone else or anyone else's spiritual journey. And a more extreme example of this, and I'm fascinated by this guy, is a guy called Simon Stylites, or Simeon Stylites sometimes. He is one of the first of what we call the popular stylite or pillar hermits. And he was born about 388 in Syria. And beginning about the age of 16, he was a shepherd boy at first, but at 16 he joined a group in a monastery-like setting where they were trying to live, together in religious practice. But he was such an extreme ascetic that even his colleagues thought, okay, this is just too bizarre, and you're not really good for community, you're not suited for community life. And so they kind of kicked him out. So he decided to go his own way, and he found this rocky precipice where there was about 20 yards worth of space, and he was going to just dedicate himself. I'm not going to leave this space. And so he's going to hang out on this 20-yard space and just kind of commit himself to his austere practices. But too many people kept coming out to him, seeking his wisdom or his guidance or prayers and so forth. He's like, okay, this is really bugging me. And so he came up with this entirely new method. He built a pillar. And he decided, well, I'm gonna live on top of this pillar until death comes. And he started off with a 9-foot pillar, and through the years he kind of changed the height of the pillar. And they say that the last pillar he had was like 50 feet from the ground. And he didn't have a tent or a building or anything. He's just sitting on top of this pillar, practicing his austerities. And he never, would leave this thing. People would, pull up his food through a rope and have other business taken care of in other ways. But, he spent 36 years on this pillar. And you're like, okay, really? This is an amazing example of endurance and commitment. But once again, I'm wondering, is this really what Jesus has in mind when he talks about denying oneself? And I don't mean to belittle Simeon for what he did, because, in some respects, even though he's on this pillar, people did come to him. You could see in some of the portraits there, he's not completely outside of human contact. People will come and actually listen to him preach and all that kind of good stuff. So he did accomplish some good there, but if this is what the gospel message is really about, we're in trouble. You just can't find a good pillar these days. And our climate's just not really, suited for pillar life. You can do that in the desert where it's kind of warm and you can hang out without shelter. But I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to spend a winter in Nashville on a pillar. I'm just saying. Let me give you one last example before we move on. And this is from our own times. I don't know if you've ever heard of this guy, Arthur Blessitt. The older folks maybe knows this guy. Back in the 1970s, but I don't know if he might still be alive, but he might be still doing this. But back in the 1970s, he got a lot of publicity. I even have a book of his where he decided that God had called him to carry a cross, literally a wooden cross across the world. And so he constructed this 12-foot wooden cross. Now, it had a wheel on the end of it. And I don't know if that makes it, if that discounts it or not. But I guess, you kind of need a wheel. Otherwise, it would after a while, it would become a 10-foot cross and then an 8-foot cross. And then it just gets shorter, the more you dragged it. So he has a wheel on it. But one of his journeys, he carries this cross from Panama City to Colombia through the Darien jungle. And he's got all kinds of poisonous snakes and this dense, I don't even know how it gets through, chopping the way through the forest, over rugged mountains, carrying this cross. And he believed that through his literal carrying of the cross, he would be able to proclaim the world the message of the gospel. And I guess he'd make some difference in some people's lives. But I'm not sure that this is what Jesus had in mind when he said to carry your cross. So what are we to do with this text? Then he called the crowd to him and said, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. What do we do with that text? Is Jesus asking us to deny who we are? Are we supposed to feel bad about ourselves? There's this old hymn, I don't know if you've ever heard it. It's called, Alas, and Did My Savior Bleed? And in the original version, they've actually changed it in some of the modern versions. But in the original version, the verse ran this way. Alas, and did my Savior bleed, and did my sovereign die? Would he devote that sacred head for such a worm as I? Now, this worm theology was meant at the time to kind of be indicative of the gulf between ourselves and God, and it was meant to just accentuate that God is so much greater than we are. Yet for many people, they began to view discipleship as this kind of self-deprecating kind of thing, that we have to feel bad about ourselves, that somehow self-denial means giving up on ourselves. It means that we shouldn't love ourselves, that it means that we, good measure of self-loathing was actually a healthy thing, that you needed to kind of hate yourself a little bit, and then you were a true disciple of Jesus. That somehow we had to punish ourselves because we're such horrible individuals. Yet I think that without some sense of who we are and some self-love in a sense, you can't really love others. That you have to have a place where you're stable and you're feeling okay about yourself. So I think the best way to understand this text is to place beside it another text. And we can only fully understand what it means to be truly a disciple of Jesus when we look at what Jesus was like and what he has done. So Christ is our model. And those who want to follow him must learn from him. So I want to look at Philippians 2, 1 through 8. Let's read this text. If you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any fellowship with the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and purpose. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Now, in this early Christian hymn, Paul is, of course, exalting Christ in language of tremendous depth, and this is a really pretty profound and high Christology that we have here. But he does so in order to use Jesus as a model for Christian behavior, because Paul is addressing a church that is struggling with personal rivalries. The church is being torn apart not only from people on the outside, but even people from within, where there's tension among Christian brothers and sisters. And so he contrasts two modes of behavior that can model themselves for Christians. One is the perspective that thinks very highly of oneself to the exclusion of others, and all my actions and my attitudes and what I do and how I live are motivated by what benefits me. That's one approach that you could have. And he contrasts that with the second perspective, which places the primary perspective or focus on the needs of others, on how I can benefit those around me. Paul does not promote self-loathing, but what Paul promotes is humility. For Paul, humility refers to this absence of pride and self-assertion, where I recognize it's not all about me. It's characteristic, by the way, that would have been anathema to the first century Roman culture. They had nothing to do with humility. They didn't like humility at all. They thought that was weakness, and that was only appropriate for servants. But Paul says this is the key to turning away from self and being able to love others. Humility. So Paul adds, consider or regard others as better than yourselves. And in this context of disagreement and rivalry, Paul is calling them to cultivate the ability to see things through the other person's eyes, the other person's perspective, to look at it how they see it. Because if you become so defensive of your own position, then you tune out what anybody else has to say and you're focused only on what you believe. Have you ever noticed how different an argument goes when you're arguing with someone you respect versus someone you don't? Because if you respect them, you listen to them and you try and understand what they're saying. Now notice in verse 4, Paul says, keep your attention on your own, not only on your own things, but also that of others. Because excessive attention on one's own interest is a characteristic of a lack of humility, when all I can think about is my own stuff. And it becomes the seedbed of self-ambition and conceit. But in a church setting, what that means is that I need to recognize and make sure that my needs and my wants and my desires and my agenda are not the only things I'm pursuing to the exclusion of others, but I recognize that everybody is important in this matter. But the key verse happens in verse 6. Paul is going to focus specifically on Christ's attitude, and it's really kind of tricky to even know how to translate this correctly. There's a problem word here that we're not exactly sure what to do with it. And so there's three different translations. One is he did not consider such equality with God, a prize to be snatched or gained. As if Christ was thinking, can I even possibly become God? And he said, no, I'm not going to do that. But Paul has already talked about his equality with God, that he's the very nature of God. And so that doesn't seem like a very good translation. In the second version, it says that Christ did not consider equality with God, which he already enjoyed, a prized possession, to be retained, to be held on to be clutched tightly, but he was willing to let it go. Now that's a really interesting translation. I think somewhat helpful that he said, I've got equality with God, but I'm going to let that go for the sake of others. But the third one, I think, is even pushing that meaning a little bit further. It says, Christ did not think that the state of being equal with God consisted in snatching or getting. The word here that's at stake is snatch or grasp or clutch. We're not exactly sure what to do with that word. With this last interpretation, the way we would translate this is to understand not who, though being in very nature God or form of God, but because he was in the very form of God, did not clutch or grasp. That what that means is God-likeness is not found in grasping or clutching, but is found in emptying. What it means to be God is to empty oneself. He emptied himself of his glory, of his divine prerogatives, of his majesty, of his right to be served. He emptied all of that, taking on the form of a slave. And he humbled himself, being obedient even to death. Because Christ becomes our model for what it means to have radical obedience. Jesus not merely died, but he died the death of a criminal. I mean, if there's any place to assert one's authority and power, it's on the cross. Yet he chose to consider the needs of others above his own. The reason he died, the reason he was willing to go through such humiliation was not for his own sake or his own agenda, but for us. And it wasn't a momentary choice. This was the goal all along, that throughout his ministry, every decision he made pointed to this end. And he said yes to the cross at every stage of the ministry. And he obeyed God throughout his life, knowing what awaited him. And we should also remember when Paul is penning these words to the Philippians, he is not in some ivory tower somewhere, that Paul himself is in prison awaiting potentially a deadly fate. willing to put his own life on the line for the sake of his faith. And so as we reflect on this text, what we need to recognize is the way Jesus models self-denial and what carrying the cross looks like. Denying self is done not because the self is somehow bad or unhealthy or unworthy or evil or anything like that. Jesus denies himself not from a sense of worthlessness, not because he thinks, oh, I'm such a bad person. He does it from an understanding of his true identity. Now think through that for just a second. The reason he denies himself is not because he thinks himself unworthy, but because he knows who he is. And it's from a recognition of the needs of others that he is willing to give up what is best for himself. Now, of course, we're not equal with God. We're not like Jesus, but we are made in the image of God. And so Jesus exhibits it for us, I think, the kind of attitude that we ourselves should have toward others. That denial of self is not a devaluing of self. It's not me thinking less and less of myself. Denial of self is an elevation of others to at least equal with my own status. We deny ourselves in order to be of service to others. Because without a healthy view of ourselves, we can't really love others. And the problem is that myself and my own needs are an ever-present reality. Self is a subject that impinges on me constantly. Now again, this might be self-confession. Maybe you guys are always thinking about others. But most of the time, I'm thinking about me. It's just, constant presence there in my head. I wake up and I'm thinking about me. My needs, my concerns are never far from me. But your needs and your concerns, they're going to take a little more effort for me to discern. I got to spend some energy to figure that out. So self-denial stands at the very center of discipleship because we were created for community. And a community is destroyed by self-interest. All we have to do is go back to Genesis and look at the stories. Once people kind of took off doing their own thing, how that all worked out. But God, through his grace, calls us back into relationship with him. And when he does so, he reconnects us with each other. And the key to that is recognizing that it's not all about me. In a community, it can't be all about me. But at the same time, it can't be all about you either. It's got to be a healthy respect and concern for each other. It's reciprocal. So what does denying the self look like? I think it means that our concerns, our priorities, our energies are not primarily self-directed. I mean that we don't simply ask what's best for me, but we begin to ask what's best for everyone, for the all. It's reflected in the way we use our time and resources. Denying self is this project we're involved in every minute of every day where we begin to see others in a new way. So one of the songs we had is trying to see things as God sees them. It doesn't involve packing up and moving to the desert. It doesn't involve standing on some stone pillar somewhere. It means sharing your heart even when you don't feel like it. It means recognizing the needs of others as well as your own. It means living a life of balance that is motivated not by guilt or insecurity or by fear, but out of a healthy sense of who you are in Christ and an honest recognition of the value of others, that you see them as creatures of God, as fellow travelers, because we deny self for the sake of others. I invite the praise team to come up as we close. It's a constant struggle, you see, because my needs cry out far louder than all the rest. And so denying self starts with seeing others and recognizing their worth and their value no matter what their circumstances might be. Jesus wants us to realize that it's not all about me and it's not all about you. The message is it's all about us because we live in community. Let's praise him.